Welcome to Sustainability Now, solutions to shape a world that works. Designed for everyone interested in responsible stewardship of the planet, covering food, energy, housing, water, waste, health, economics, and consciousness. Welcome to your community, Sustainability Now, with your host, Mira Rubin.
Welcome, everybody, to Sustainability Now, technologies and paradigms to shape a world that works. I'm your host, Mira Rubin, and I am excited to introduce you today to Maggy Pollicino. With a degree in sustainability studies and a background in wildlife rehabilitation, Maggy is the outreach coordinator for the Florida Keys Wild Bird Center in Tavernier, Florida. There, she's responsible for education and volunteer engagement and occasionally assists at the rehabilitation hospital. Maggy also volunteers as a diver for local coral and seagrass restoration projects. And Maggy, it is such a pleasure to have you here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited. This is my first podcast.
Ooh, okay. Well, congratulations. This is a great way to start. Yeah. We're excited to have you for your first experience. So we're talking originally because the bird center, the Wild Bird Center, came onto my radar through my father. And my father was a veterinarian, Dr. Lee Rubin, and I think people knew him there as Dr. Lee. Mm-hmm. And he did surgery in his retirement. He did surgery on the birds at the rehabilitation hospital. So it got me to thinking, well, we haven't really spoken to any kind of organization that does wildlife rehabilitation. Actually, there's one other person that we spoke with, but this is on a different scale. And so I think it's a really interesting thing to make people aware of about these rehabilitation facilities. And it'll also give us an opportunity to explore some of the ecosystems surrounding avian wildlife in Southern Florida. So maybe you could give us a little bit of an intro to the Wild Bird Center.
Yeah, so we are a nonprofit, so that means that we rely purely on donations from public and private donors, as well as grants. So really a lot of our donations come in through visitors. So we have both a rehabilitation clinic where we are doing hands-on medical care for sick and injured native wild birds to Florida. If we get any non-native species that show up at our door, we are able to stabilize those guys and transfer them on to a different facility that does have a permit for those species, if possible. And then on the public side of things, we have a sanctuary where we house non-releasable native birds. So people can come and they can walk along our boardwalk. And on either side, we have exhibits that have these birds that are not able to survive in the wild by themselves due to illness or injury, but they have a good enough quality of life that they make for a good ambassador bird. So it's a really great way to allow people to connect with these species that they might not notice in the wild or might not ever encounter in the wild. We do have one species over at the sanctuary that's very special, and you will only be able to see it in Florida in the United States. The rest of its range is in Mexico and Central and South America. So we have a few really, really special birds over there to help people connect with the wildlife around them.
That's exciting. And maybe you can give us a little bit of an education, like what would be that species that you can only see in Florida? What are some of the other, I've got a string of questions.
Yeah.
Hang on for a second. So, and what would be some of the other species besides that particularly special? And you also said that you need special permitting for these other non-native birds, and that's something I'm very curious about as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so why don't we start off with the permitting question? So for at least in the United States, I'm not familiar with any sort of laws that are outside of the United States. So if you're a listener from outside of the US, this may not apply. But in the United States, you need a special permit to rehabilitate any native wildlife, whether it's a mammal or a reptile, a bird. Some animals even hold specific permits. Like, for example, we are permitted for native wild birds of Florida, but if a bald eagle comes through our doors, they require an additional special permit. So we actually have to transfer any bald eagle that we get. Thankfully, there is another nearby clinic that has permits for bald eagles, so it works out. Non-native species that come through our doors, we legally cannot release those back into the wild. So, and that is true for, for any non-native species. Because they may be invasive. At the very least, they're not native, and they're potentially taking up an ecological niche and driving native species to North America out of their habitat. So there are other options for those species. There's a lot of sanctuaries that permanently house those species. Some places even adopt them out. So we have other options there, but typically we're just stabilizing those animals. But of course, if they are, gravely injured and are not going to recover, a center can help that animal pass peacefully.
Give me an idea of what some of these non-native species might be.
Yeah, so a really popular one down here is the Eurasian collared dove. A lot of people do mistake them for the native mourning dove. So, we have tons of those guys around here, and they do take up habitat and a niche that the mourning dove or a ground dove or maybe not a white crowned pigeon. So we'll stick with mourning dove and ground doves and different native doves. They're kind of out competing those species because the Eurasian collared dove is a little bit better at surviving. They're a little bit more hardier. So that's a good example of a native species being pushed out by a non-native one that turns out to be invasive. A non-bird example would be the green iguanas and the Burmese pythons that are taking over the Keys and South Florida. So they are really decimating this native ecosystem, which we don't have a whole lot of left. Prevention methods and removal methods, as sad as sometimes those can be, it really is necessary to preserve the really unique biodiversity that we have here in South Florida.
So what are those species doing to the ecosystem? What kind of impact are they having besides decimating it, like more specific?
Yeah, so a lot of them are eating the eggs of native species, or even if it's a non-egg laying species, they're eating up those babies. So it's a lot harder for native species to maintain their population levels. We've got a lot in reports of green iguanas, going into native bird nests. And they're primarily thought of as herbivores, but people have seen them eating eggs and little nestlings before they can fend for themselves. Burmese pythons can get so big that they can eat native crocodiles and alligators to a certain point. And the big thing is that these non-native species, they breed very prolifically. So their population numbers can just skyrocket exponentially. So they're taking up the space that these native species don't have a lot of left. And they typically have a wider variety of a diet to eat, or they can make space for themselves a lot more easily than a native species might need to rely on something very specific. For example, we have a very special bird here, which is, I think, a great segue into these special species that we have at the sanctuary. One of them is the white-crowned pigeon. And in the US, you can only see these here in South Florida and maybe a little bit of Miami, but mostly South Florida. And these guys rely on mangrove habitats and hardwood hammock habitats to both breed and feed. So if you have another big predator that's not usually here, that these birds haven't adapted to, and evolved with, you're going to run into a lot of conflict there, and push more of these native species out of where they have a right to live. Yeah, so that is really the big problem with invasive species is yes, directly conflicting with other wildlife, but also just taking up so much space.
So where did they come from? How did they get here? Is it pets that people let into the wild, or?
Yeah, so a lot of them are pets. There was a big hurricane several years ago in which a breeding facility was breached for Burmese pythons. I am not versed in the origins of the iguana problem. I'm sure could have been a combination of pets. Maybe they came over on a boat with certain shipments, because they, their native range isn't too far away in Mexico and Central and South America. There's different possibilities there. Unfortunately, I don't know the exact way that they came over, but the Burmese pythons were definitely introduced via released pets, and of course that breach of that big breeding facility during, I want to say it was Hurricane Andrew.
Wow.
But I could be wrong on that.
It brings up such an interesting question about the preservation of native species. As climate is changing, people are deliberately breeding trees, for instance, that are more hardy in the changing climate, for instance. And I wonder about that. Are you, as part of the bird sanctuary, engaged in any of that actual preservation activity, or?
No, we're not. So we are a very, very small organization. We have 6 permanent staff members with the addition of interns that we cycle through. So even when we're fully staffed, we're really a skeleton crew. And that's true for a lot of rehabilitation centers. So we do get a lot of people asking us questions about different research going on or bird banding. But the fact is those are typically separate entities. Some of those are government run. And for the most part, a lot of rehabilitation centers they're just trying to take care of the birds that come through their clinic and get them back out into the wild. And they don't have the time or the resources to be able to devote more energy to something like habitat restoration, even though it's so important to our mission. We have to leave that to an organization that is directly focused on that.
I want to circle back to this notion of permitting, because so many of us have found a wild animal that needed help. I mean, YouTube is filled with all kinds of videos of people caring for wild animals or birds, and it's interesting to know that that's actually not legal.
Yeah, and the reason that it's not legal, of course, there is definitely a problem with accessibility and the knowledge about wildlife rehabilitation, because it sort of only became, an official field in the 20th century, mid to late 20th century. So, a lot of people still don't even know that it exists, that there are places where you can take this wild animal to. They think that the only option is to call animal control and that they're going to euthanize it, but that's not necessarily true. A lot of times animal control calls centers like us to get that animal into care. There are not many people out there that just want to euthanize something for the sake of euthanizing it. These people do want to help. And so the reason for the permits is because it is so easy to make a mistake with wild animals. Their biology and anatomy is so different from ours, and humans, we have a lot of very intense instincts, and we tend to think that we know what's best. Even if you're looking on the internet for instructions, you can find 5 different ways to take care of a baby bird, and depending on what species of bird you have, all of those might be incorrect, and you can make a mistake that was extremely preventable, but that's also fatal to that bird, especially when you're dealing with baby animals. They need very specific food, a very specific schedule on how to receive that food, a very specific way in which they receive that food. A lot of these animals need to be fed via having tubes put down their throats. And if we have our trachea and our esophagus. Animals have the same thing. And if you don't know which way to stick that tube, because it's different for every animal, you could end up killing this baby that, of course you didn't intend to kill, you just wanted to help it. But biology and anatomy is just one of the reasons why it's so important to get that animal to a licensed professional. And the other big reason that I'll say for the sake of the animal is also imprinting. So imprinting is the stage that all baby animals go through, and it's when they are forming their identity based off of their caretaker. So if you have a human baby being held by a human, they look up, and as their vision starts to not get quite as blurry, they identify with their caretaker, and they look up at mom or dad or any other guardian, and they say, I am what you are. Baby birds, opossums, raccoons, they all go through that same stage. And if an animal imprints on something that is not its species or not close enough to its species, it's not going to be able to learn the skills needed to survive out in the wild. Or even if it can reasonably find food for itself and evade predators, just the fact that they are friendly with humans can get them into a lot of trouble, because not every human is going to be friendly towards it. And that can be either through, direct violence that a human inflicts on this friendly animal, or it can be indirect, like a manatee being, having a positive opinion of boats because they've gotten fresh water from a boat in the past, and then they see another boat and they approach it and they get hit by a propeller. So a lot of things, just do your best to get it to a rehabilitator. And Mira, maybe I can send you this link that you could put in your show notes or something. But
Sure.
there's an online website where you can basically punch in your zip code, and it will bring up the closest licensed rehabilitators in your area. I'm not sure if this is international or if it's just in the United States,
Do
though.
you know what the link is? Because you could speak it now, and we'll include it on our website where we post the podcast.
Yeah, so the website is called Animal Help Now. So it's just ahnow.org. And it's really helpful. They also have some preliminary information that pops up when you first open the website that says, hey, what kind of animal have you found? Before doing anything else, make sure you have it in a box, it's in a warm, dark place, and then you can kind of move on to what the next steps are. So very, very helpful resource.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah.
So let's talk more about the sanctuary and the rehabilitation, and what species you're dealing with mostly there in Southern Florida.
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the season. So like I mentioned, we do have some really unique species to Florida. We talked about the white-crowned pigeon, which is always super special to get through our clinic. The other species that you can only see in Florida in the US is the short-tailed hawk. It's a very elusive bird. It's actually on the top of a list of vertebrates needing more research. There's almost no research on this bird in the United States. I'm not sure if there's any additional research in other countries, because it does have quite a wide range in South America as well. But we have a completely separate Florida population, and these birds are so beautiful. They're specialized bird eaters. I might be able to send some pictures that you can post on your website, but absolutely gorgeous bird. They come in two colors, actually. So they come in a dark morph and a light morph. So very, very special bird to see. We're very grateful that we were able to save these two individuals of that species.
And they're there at the sanctuary?
Yep, they're there at the sanctuary. They're named Bolt Enlightening. So they're there for people to see. And yeah, again, I just can't emphasize how much of a special bird this is. Very cool to see.
Hawks, what kind of enclosures do you have for them? What kind of lifestyle are you able to provide for these birds that can't survive in the wild?
Yeah, so raptors in general, unless they're hunting, they're kind of lazy birds. Sometimes the enclosures can be smaller than some people might expect. Of course, we have them nice and high, and we do have them wide enough that if the bird wants to make a few laps around in the enclosure, it absolutely can. But the other thing to keep in mind is that most of our birds are not flighted. Most of them have wing or eye injuries, so even if they have the ability to use both of their wings, if they don't have the vision for that, they're not going to attempt to try to fly unless they're really spooked. But we have lots of different perching options in there, which is very important for the health of a bird's feet. It needs to have a lot of different textures to be able to avoid something called bumblefoot. For anybody that owns chickens, you're probably very familiar with that. And of course, we have water bowls out for them. There's a shade structure in every enclosure. And we try to do our best to make sure that there are areas of the enclosure that are furthest from the boardwalk, so that if a bird is feeling a little bit uncomfortable, it can kind of go into one corner and avoid guests for the most part. But most of our birds are pretty indifferent to our guests. And we have broad-winged hawks. We have several different species of owls. We have turkey vultures, red-shouldered hawks, and of course, seabirds. We have a lot of different seabirds. So we have pelicans, laughing gulls, cormorants. We have a lesser black-backed gull. We have a few different species of egret and heron. And some songbirds, of course, that you would be able to see in most of the United States.
Wow, it sounds like a very, very diverse collection of birds for such a small team.
Yeah, and of course, this organization has been built up for over 35 years, a lot with the help of a huge volunteer base and community support. So it's really amazing what these people have built, and it's a privilege to be able to continue that legacy and keep providing help and sanctuary to these birds that need it.
For sure. Can you tell us more about birds? You're mentioning bumblefoot, and in our previous conversation, you talked about the nuances of different feathers and how the kinds of injuries that you see. And maybe you can tell us more about those things.
Yeah, of course. So I would say the most common injuries that we see have to do with head trauma. So the bird collided with a vehicle or a window or even a tree or fell out of the nest. Head trauma neurological symptoms are pretty popular. Broken bones, general emaciation. So emaciation is when you are so skinny that the body starts eating its own tissues. That can happen for a variety of different reasons. And bumblefoot is something that we see every now and then. So that's basically a hard blister on the bottom of that foot. And that usually results from uneven weight distribution or a lack of different surfaces that the bird has access to. So that's why it's really important that we provide our rehab patients as well as our permanent residents a lot of different surfaces and textures so that we make sure that their feet and joints are staying healthy. And a lot of these injuries, they seem minor, and they might be minor and something like us or another mammal, but birds are so delicate. And this is also kind of getting into the feathers. For an animal that can fly, every part of its body is very, very crucial, especially the wings and the bones in the chest area. So if just one of those things is off, it can unfortunately be a death sentence, even though it means a very minor, even though it seems like a very minor injury to someone like us. Whereas we break our arm, we throw a cast on it, maybe we pin it, and we call it a day after 4 to 6 weeks. But for birds, if that injury is, say near a joint, if you break a bone near a joint, what happens when that bone heals is that there's a calcium deposit to help heal the bone. Now, if that's near a joint, I have full mobility of this elbow here, but if I were to get a calcium deposit right at the joint, maybe I can only move my elbow up that much. And when you're something that can fly, you're relying on full mobility of everything. So there are a lot of nuances in the cases that we see, and it's very much a case-by-case basis if a bird is releasable when it has injuries like those.
So talk about the nuances of feathers, if you would. I found this so completely fascinating and something I knew nothing about. It never even occurred to me.
Yeah, so feathers are really unique, and they're unique from bird to bird. So of course you have feathers for cosmetic reasons. A lot of male birds, particularly songbirds, tend to be very colorful and have these fun crests and different tail feathers. And a lot of those are purely for cosmetic reasons. So we see a lot of cosmetic beauty in feathers. But of course, there are also functional feathers. So flight feathers are arguably the most important feather to a bird, as well as the tail feathers. So tail feathers are usually helping a bird steer, particularly for those birds that inhabit dense forests and they need to maneuver a lot between trees or different obstacles. Some birds have much broader tails if they're a soaring bird, such as a red-tailed hawk or a turkey vulture. And some birds have feathers placed in a way that make them exceptionally aerodynamic, such as frigate birds was the bird that we were talking about. That can be difficult to rehabilitate because they're so big. First of all, they have a very large wingspan, but they have
How big a wingspan would you say?
Between 6 and 7 feet.
Wow.
Yeah, they are big birds. And they have these very long, magnificent tail and flight feathers that you really want to make sure don't get damaged, because if a feather breaks or is kinked, it's not automatically going to grow back. It's not like human hair or fur. So birds go through a molt sometimes once a year, sometimes a couple times a year. It really depends on the species. This kind of goes back into humans without licenses trying to care for wildlife. A really common thing that a lot of rehab centers see is people trying to unstick birds from glue traps, and the way that they do it is they just cut the feathers off and they let the bird go, and they assume, those will grow back. It might take months for those feathers to grow back, and the flight feathers are attached to bone. So, you can't just be plucking those. It's very painful from where the feather shafts grow out. So feather health for a bird is very, very important. A lot of them have to maintain waterproofing so that they don't get too cold, or so that they don't get waterlogged in the water. Ospreys are a bird that dive into the water. They're not just swooping over it and grabbing a fish. They are going into that water and taking off directly. Their whole body is under there and they just bring their wings out. It's incredible if you can see it in person. So osprey need to have really, really good waterproofing to make sure that they don't get weighed down by any water being held in their feathers, so that they can take off and hunt successfully without getting too exhausted.
Wow.
Yeah.
You are such a wealth of information. This is so interesting and exciting to me, because you're making something visible that most of us never even think about.
Yeah. And a feather that I really like to talk about are owl feathers. So I kept referencing this picture of the barred owl in our last conversation. I wish I had brought a feather with me, but owl feathers are adapted to help them fly silently. There's a great video that I will definitely send to you that it was a research project that the BBC did, and they had 3 species of birds fly over a set of microphones so that they could measure how loud those birds flew. First one was a rock dove, or most people know those as city pigeons. The second was a peregrine falcon. And the third was a barn owl. And the first 2 birds were pretty loud. They sounded differently from each other, but you could hear it with, without any aid. But the barn owl was so silent that the microphones barely picked up anything. And it's flying, directly over this microphone from right here. So owl feathers tend to be more velvety and soft, and they also have a special structure on the edge of their flight feathers. So they basically, the edge of it is a comb, so the wind is more easily able to pass through that, and that is what helps them fly so quietly. Makes them an exceptional predator, because if you don't hear something coming for you, you know, that is a great way to get snatched up by an owl.
For sure.
Mhm.
So tell us, let's look at the ecology. Particularly, let's look at a barn owl and how their threats from the environment are impacting a bigger picture, if you could, just because we don't really understand. You know, we see birds flying around, but very few of us, myself included, have ever really dug into what's the life cycle, how does this whole thing work. So
Yeah, so a barred owl is a really great example. So barred owls, they need big tree cavities to nest in. So you're mostly going to find them in mature or old growth forests, which is a type of forest that is rapidly dwindling here in the United States and around the world. Barred owls are actually used as indicator species in forest management. If the barred owls are still there in healthy numbers, that means that this forest is being successfully and healthily managed. So along with the larger tree cavities that these barred owls need to breed, they also need a healthy food chain that's below them. So there need to be, you know, enough native plants and understory for rodents to survive, and snakes, and even large insects as well, so that the barred owl, excuse me, has enough food to survive by itself, but also raise its young. So if we are getting rid of all of these huge trees, or even to, you know, a different extent, we're getting rid of prairies or grasslands, or even just the understory, and we're eliminating habitat for what these owls feed on, eventually they are not going to be able to survive in the numbers that they once did. And then, you know, some other smaller species or non-native species, or things that we consider pests, those populations might start to boom, as long as they can find a different food source and shelter source than the ones that we've already eliminated. And, you know, no one is going to be able to keep those things in check. And we're going to see a loss and a shift of biodiversity. And, you know, to an extent, we can sort of predict what different impacts that is going to have, but also we're in the middle of an unprecedented event. So to an extent, we really don't know what's going to happen.
yeah,
Mhm.
that's the truth. So what kinds of contributions do the barn owls make to their environment also?
Yeah, so barred owls are mostly, they're great pest control. And I also want to talk about, you know, just the intrinsic value of a lot of species, because it's sort of a, I don't know if double-edged sword is the right phrase, but you know, we like to ask the question, okay, what is this animal doing for us? What is it contributing to us? And, you know, to a lesser extent, a lot of people say, okay, what does it contribute to the environment? But I think humans, we have a tendency to always kind of bring it back to us.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, everything on this earth has some sort of intrinsic value. It is valuable just for the sake of it being itself.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yes, it is not all about human beings.
Yeah, it doesn't
have the right to exist just because.
Exactly. It doesn't necessarily have to be functional. Now, I'm sure that it is. And rodent population is a very important function. You know, if we didn't have owls and raptors, we would have an explosion of rodent populations. However, for other species, like we were talking about the brown pelican, you know, they, of course, they keep smaller fish populations, you know, kind of down without them booming. They're also used as indicator species, particularly in California for the commercial fishing industry over there. If there's, you know, if they're depleting the fish resources there, the brown pelicans are going to move on to somewhere else. But again, these species, they don't necessarily need to have a function to have a right for us to want to protect them and to restore their habitat. Of course, biodiversity is always the healthier option and is going to make our planet healthier. And I'm sure that there are species out there that have gone extinct or that are going extinct and we don't even know about it, where we don't quite yet know their function. And so we might not miss them, so to speak, because we don't know what they're missing. But yeah, I'm a big proponent for, even if we don't understand the function of something, this animal or this plant or this bacterium, this fungi was here for a reason at some point. And even if that's not a good reason for us, it should be reason enough.
Thank you so much for that clarification. It was a poorly stated question on my part.
No, and you know what? That is the go-to question, because especially in conservation, we want to give other people a reason to care and to change their ways. And for a lot of people, particularly the ones higher up in government, intrinsic value is not enough of a reason for them. You need an economical function, you need a tourism function, something like that, which is, not the greatest way to think about the environment, because this is our home that we share with these creatures. But it's not a bad question. It's definitely valid, especially to get other people to care.
Well, the intention of the question really was not to say how was it valuable, how are these animals or creatures valuable to us, but how are they working with the larger ecosystem, to be able to give us a deeper sense of the interconnection and interwovenness of things. That was really the intended question.
Yeah. So like I said, pest control, keeping those smaller species and their populations from booming, and just kind of keeping everybody in check so that those animals that do live in the understory, there's enough room for everyone, there's enough food for everyone, and that there's no one species taking over another. Owls will eat a whole variety of different things. A lot of wild animals are opportunistic predators, so some of them are specialized and they're really picky eaters, but owls, they will eat snakes, they'll eat birds, they'll eat mice, rats, grasshoppers. Barred owls have actually been known to, they like wetland areas as well, so they'll go down and they'll eat frogs and tadpoles and salamanders and even fish if it's in shallow enough water. So overall, they're really the big predator species in their ecosystem, making sure that no one smaller species is kind of taking over.
Well, and it's interesting too, if we extrapolate on that, for instance, if rodents became prevalent in an understory, then they would be consuming lots of plants, and there would be impact from them consuming the plant species that they're consuming that would impact other things and insects, and it just goes on and on.
Yeah, and even the way that these animals find shelter, some of them are burrowing. So if we have too many burrowing species, that could really impact the whole structure of the forest and how future plant growth happens. And also, for rats and mice in particular, those species are really good at urbanizing themselves. So they get more out into human society, and they can cause problems for us. Health problems, of course, is a big one. But also, if we see more of those species out there, a lot of times we're going to see more, methods to exterminate those. And those aren't always very friendly to wildlife. I actually had a very recent interaction where I was giving a presentation on owls, and I had a slide about rat poison on there and how it can have negative effects on non-target wildlife. And I had this very nice gentleman come up to me after, and he was really excited to tell me actually that the poisons that the industry uses now are not harmful to wildlife, because the EPA banned strychnine and these all other chemicals. And he was in the industry, and he was so excited to be like, no, like, we got better. And it's a shame to know that these people are being tricked into thinking that they're not contributing to something bad, but if your dog gets into a rat bait box, you take it to the vet immediately. That is an adverse effect on another mammal. And rehab centers still see the effects of toxicosis in raptors and owls that have ingested rodents that have eaten rat bait. And he is right. A lot of those really, really horrible chemicals that we used to use, they are banned from retail sales. However, there are lots of loopholes, and there are usually exceptions for agricultural use. And our agricultural land is only expanding, not only wiping out the little habitat that our species have left, plants and animals. So that that means you're going to have more native wildlife interacting with these poisons. And even the ones that still are on the market, a really popular one is they use anticoagulants. So that's basically a blood thinner. And if a rat, has a lot of blood thinners in it, and then an owl or a hawk eats that rat and then gets a small cut or something that usually wouldn't be a big deal, it's not unreasonable to think that that could become a fatal injury if it just keeps bleeding and bleeding and bleeding, and its blood can't clot. So unfortunately, these things are still very, very prevalent. And I always say that prevention is the best method. I understand that that's not always feasible, especially for established problems. But there are definitely, good alternatives starting to come out that more affect fertility rather than using poisons that will affect other wildlife. So keeping in mind that, spillover into human society of these animals, which we spilled over into their society first. We cleared land and built our homes in their home, but increased human interaction usually ends up being negative for wildlife. So keeping that in mind too.
Yeah. Tavernier is in the Keys, the Florida Keys. So there's a lot of fishing there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a good segue for us to understand some of the injuries, the hook injuries that you're encountering, and also to segue into the policies that you have, how you're feeding the birds and working with the local ecosystem.
Yeah, so fishing, commercial fishing and recreational fishing is a really important it's a really important part of the local economy here in the Keys. And unfortunately, we do see lots of negative impacts to wildlife. And it's not for lack of trying to be more wildlife friendly. It's just the bottom line is you can only make something so wildlife friendly. Fishing is never going to be 100% safe for non-target species. And we see this most of the time in cormorants, brown pelicans, and laughing gulls. Those are three main species that we get either wrapped up in fishing line from usually two different scenarios. Either someone was fishing around some mangroves or around some trees, they got their line snagged and they just cut the line and they move on, and they don't bother to attempt to retrieve the line that they've cut. A bird comes along, lands in the tree, has something looped around it, kind of freaks out, it gets more and more tangled. So that's one way that we see entanglement occur. Another way is birds going after fisherman bait as they're casting out. Fishing off of bridges is really popular here. And even off of boats, this happens as well. If the bird, like we kind of used the manatee example earlier, how they associate boats with fresh water, and then they go up to a boat and they get hit by the propeller. If you're feeding a wild animal, it's going to associate humans with being fed. And if a bird sees this guy with a fish on the end of the stick and it can't see a line, the bird's like, whoa, that dude is throwing out free food. And it gets hooked when it catches the bait fish. And some people do take care to bring those animals that they've hooked into our clinic or other clinics, but a lot of people do just cut the line, and either they assume that the bird will figure it out, or they don't care what happens to the bird because the bird stole their bait. So for the most part, most of the fishermen that we've encountered have, we've had very positive experiences with them and really wanting to help the bird. And they feel so bad that this happened and that they caused this. But, there are people out there that simply don't care. So those are the two main ways that we see line entanglement and hooks. And the third way that we see that is if, you know, someone catches a fish that swallows the hook, or they're not able to get the hook out. And even to a lesser extent, which is not necessarily the fisherman's fault, is the fish gets hooked and the line snaps as they're reeling it in. That fish now is swimming around with a hook in it. Eventually, that fish is going to become easy prey. Bird comes down, eats that fish, digests the fish. That hook is metal. It's not going anywhere. It's got a barb on it. So it's just going to sit in the stomach or get caught on the throat. A lot of people, you know, I've heard them say like, oh, it'll just rust away. You know, how many times have you seen an old Pepsi can like from the 1980s in the water? You know, that stuff doesn't rust away, you know, doesn't oxidize that quickly. And, you know, just a few hours with a hook in your stomach can cause fatal damage. So we really preach, you know, remove hooks from your fish. Don't cut the line and let them go. And unfortunately, there are some barriers, some legal barriers to that. There's a lot of fish here that fishermen aren't allowed to take out of the water, or they're not allowed to attempt to remove the hook if it is going to put the fish life in danger. So we do see some, not necessarily pushback, but people trying to educate us when we're putting educational material out there about like, make sure you don't cut your line, make sure you're removing all hooks. And, you know, they come back to us and they say, well, actually like that can get people in trouble depending on the species. But yeah, as far as the injuries that we see from those entanglements and those hookings, obviously with the hooks, there's a lot of internal damage. So holes directly through the esophagus, the windpipe, into the stomach or the bowels. And if a tear happens in one of those areas, a lot of time the wounds are fatal. There are a couple of things that we can do. A really fun thing that we're always so excited when it works is we'll feed the birds cotton balls. And the idea is that the barb on the hook gets caught on the cotton and it can pass through the rest of the digestive system without doing any damage. Now, I'd say that works about 40% of the time. And if it doesn't work after a couple of days, we will call our volunteer veterinarian and she will come in and perform surgery. That surgery is really, really hard on the bird and it does not have a good outcome. Fortunately, a lot of birds pass away just from the trauma that they've sustained. And sometimes our veterinarian goes in and sees all of this damage that the hook has caused, and it's not something that she can fix. And so we need to provide, you know, a humane way of helping that bird pass on. So it's really sad to see, but we do have happy endings with the cotton balls.
It's remarkable.
Yeah, I think we spoke about last time about the pelican. She came in with 3 internal hooks and 2 external hooks, and she was all tangled up in line. And we do not get into the habit of naming our patients because we don't want to anthropomorphize them. But we named this pelican Dante because she had been to hell and back. She was emaciated, she was feisty, she had wounds on her wings, and she had 3 hooks inside of her. And, you know, she passed some of those hooks with a cotton ball. I don't remember if she passed all of them or if we did need to go into surgery for the final hook. But she was released, you know, she was a fighter, she made it through. And that was a really, really great success story. And I think the one last thing that I'll say about fishing line entanglement and hooks are, it's a bit of a popular notion to say, you know, reel in, remove, and release, but that's something that I personally am trying to move away from in my own educational messaging, because if you find a bird tangled up in fishing line, and you know, get that bird untangled, cut all the stuff up, and you let it go, it's going to do whatever it needs to do to escape. Wild animals do not like to show when they are in pain, especially in front of predators like us. So that bird could have soft tissue damage, muscle damage, damage to a tendon or ligament or a joint that might not be readily apparent when, you're throwing this bird back or setting it back down on the ground. So it's really, really important, even if you don't think that the bird is injured, super important to get it to a rehabilitator just so that we can do a head to toe exam and also make sure that there are no internal hooks, because you're not going to know unless there's lines sticking out of its mouth. Yeah, I don't advise removing a hook or line and then releasing the bird unless the bird is being strangled by any sort of line. Don't even remove anything. We have the tools and the staff to be able to safely do all of that at our clinic.
Great advice.
Yeah. But of course, if the bird is choking to death from line around its neck, cut that one. Maybe
just by virtue of doing what you do, you are supporting the ecosystem, you're supporting sustainability. However, the center also has certain policies that are directly related to sustainability. Could you share some of that with us?
Yeah, so we're not directly a sustainability organization, but there are little things that we like to do that we hope make an impact. And we are a place that doesn't have a lot of resources and staff, like I said. So I think we're a great example of how other centers just like us, even ones that have more resources than us, can still make a good impact. So one of the things is that we compost. So we provide housing for all of our interns. There's usually, 5 to 6 interns. That generates a lot of food waste. So, we have a compost bin right underneath the house, and we are able to manage our food waste there. Of course, in Florida, it's really easy to compost because it is so hot here. So, our bin hasn't even gotten halfway full because it just turns to soil so quickly. And when we do have a lot of that rich soil, we actually give it to our neighbors they're a farm, so she uses it for her planting. We get fish donated to us. Of course, the birds at our sanctuary have to eat. So we have other organizations that have a lot of fish left over, so they donate that to us. And whatever we don't use, we actually bring it back to the Key Largo fisheries, and they use that stuff that is not good enough to feed to the birds. They will sell it as bait, so it's not just going to waste somewhere. And of course, we're always trying to reduce our plastic use. Unfortunately, the medical field is one that requires a lot of single-use plastics and sterile items. But whenever we can, we try to reuse single-use items without compromising the health of our patients. Of course, we're not gonna use a non-sterile item on, a bird that clearly needs something that's sterile. But we do what we can, and in the smallest ways to reduce where we can. The same thing goes for water, just making sure everybody's turning off all of the hoses so that there's no dripping. And the one thing that I personally took on, and the person who was in my position before me also took on, was a pollinator garden. So we have very few native wildflowers left in the Keys in wild populations, unfortunately. Some of these species are only found in cultivation now at nurseries and in people's private gardens. So, we have a small area in the front of our clinic that has some native grasses, and we're hoping to add some more native wildflowers. And over at our sanctuary, we, of course, we have all of the beautiful black mangroves and red mangroves that attract native butterflies, but we do also have some additional container gardens that contain native Keys species. And unfortunately, as we were kind of moving along and buying all these plants, we found that there were so many non-native versions of our native species that a lot of times were labeled as the native variety, and they look almost exactly the same. So I was glad that I had built a pollinator garden in the past and that I was aware that things like that happen. But it was like 30% of the plants that I wanted, I noticed, hey, wait a minute, this is the non-native variety. And so, if you're not knowledgeable about that and you're just trying to do the right thing, unfortunately, you might end up, getting the wrong thing and not necessarily doing more harm, but not doing the good that you thought you were doing. So I think it's really important that people understand and kind of keep in their mindset, which is something that I try to do in my everyday life, is I know enough to know that I don't know.
That's brilliant. It's
Yeah,
true,
and
right?
I think that's really, really important in the field of conservation, because there's lots of people out there trying to do good and maybe not quite hitting the target, but they, for whatever reason, have more of a platform or a louder voice than some of these other conservationists that are really doing the right thing, but their information just isn't getting out there.
Well, something else that you discussed with me is that you have a fishing line collection program.
Yes, I knew I was forgetting something. Yeah, so we are a partner in a state program, and lots of states have this. Actually, every state I've lived in, I've noticed this program alive and well, and it's called the monofilament recovery and recycling program. So basically, we are responsible for different bins. It's like a recycling bin. It's in the shape of a PVC pipe. If you live near a lake, you might have seen those, or if you live near a popular fishing pier, it's this big old PVC pipe, and any fishing line or hooks or sinkers or anything like that, you can stick in there. And once the bin is full, whoever manages that property calls us up and says, hey, your monofilament bin's full. We come, we pick it up, and typically we have volunteers go through, sort out the metal bits from the plastic, taking out all of the regular trash that people throw in there. And they make sure it's all sorted, they clean it, it gets dried out, and we send it off to this facility in Iowa. I believe it's the Berkeley Conservation Institute. And they make sure that all that monofilament gets melted down and made into a recycled product. I know that it's not made into more monofilament. If anybody is familiar with recycling and recycled materials, you know that it's a very exact and nuanced science. You can't necessarily just melt something and make it into something else. It really depends on the type of plastic you have. This organization melts it down into plastic, and they make tackle boxes and toys or bobbers. So yeah, we're really, really excited to be a part of that. We have been a part of that for years, and the amount of fishing line that we get in a single run is incredible. Dozens and dozens of 55-gallon bags of, just filled with monofilament. And I always like to tell people, the one way that you can absolutely know that you've saved a bird's life is if you're picking out fishing line or a hook out of a tree or out of the mangroves. Like, it is almost a guarantee that you have saved the life of some animal that is very likely to just land on that branch and get tangled up in it otherwise. We have a lot of really great local people that, they go out on their paddle boards and kayaks, and that's what they do, for fun. They just go out with scissors and a bag, and they collect all of that stuff, and they'll bring it to us or their nearest, recycling station. So that's always a fun thing to do on a Saturday afternoon. If you're looking to go for a kayak, just stay along the tree line and, pick up the monofilament.
So Maggie, one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you is because we talk about how initiatives start on a local level, that's how we can really make a difference. And the Bird Center is just a wonderful example of not only a small group making a large impact, but part of that impact is also galvanizing your community. You're collaborating with other foundations and nonprofit organizations. You're creating a greater sense of place, which is so much a part really of being able to carry us into a better future. And so I'm wondering if we can sort of use this opportunity to extend the community a bit by telling people how they can help, how they can support what you all are up to.
Yeah, so the conservation nonprofit community in the Keys is, one of the biggest communities that I've ever seen for such a small area. We have so many great organizations helping with coral restoration and ocean health, which directly impacts our mission for seabirds. We have a wonderful woman who rescues foxes from fur farms that cannot be released because they're domesticated animals. We have some really, really great relationships with wildlife centers like Positive Beginnings, the Marathon Wild Bird Center, the Key West Wildlife Center, other seabird stations and wildlife clinics up on the mainland. And we also try to, whenever we are out in the community at street fairs, we try to interact as much as we can, even with those more indirectly related organizations, such as ocean conservation and coral restoration and things like that. But the ways that you can really, really help and make an impact is to donate to these places, even if it's just $1 or $5. Like I said, nonprofits, we run completely off of donations and grants. There's not too many, state funded or government funded organizations doing this kind of work. They do exist, but for the most part, it is a lot of nonprofits. Following these places on social media. The rise of social media has been really, really great for organizations like us, particularly with education. And especially after the pandemic hit and everybody is online and becoming more well-versed, and we're getting all of these different platforms to speak from, like doing podcasts. Of course, podcasts were around, but now they're even more popular because because of the pandemic. So
can you share your website, how we can donate, your social media, Instagram, whatever, so that people can follow? We'll post them on the website, but if you can speak them now, that would be great.
Yeah, so we are at Keep Them Flying. So KEEP them flying. So you can find us on Facebook and Instagram under that. I will say there are a few older accounts that are no longer in use. So just see, if you're clicking on one of those names, make sure that the last post was very recent, like within the last week. If it's something from 2015, that is no longer in use, and we don't use that anymore. But we post just about every day. And we have a mixture of educational content as well as just some fun, cute bird content to get people interested. And our website is also keepthemflying.org.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we will post these links on our website at sustainabilitynow.global. That's .global instead of .com. And also any photographs that you provide us. So Maggie, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask?
Yeah, well, I would like to take the opportunity to talk a little bit. We touched on human development and climate change a little bit, but I think the biggest threat facing birds and a lot of animals and plants today are habitat loss. And I think people hear the term habitat loss, it's kind of like a buzz phrase. And I just wanted to kind of go over the 6 main ingredients for a healthy habitat, which is air, sun, food, water, shelter, and space. And I think what is becoming more prevalent in the news now is air and space. So we're seeing a lot of decreases in air quality and having enough room for these animals to and plants and fungi and bacteria to have enough space to live. I think a lot of people think about, just deforestation and wildfires and having animals die in direct events from these things, but also if their air quality is decreasing, their water quality is decreasing, and of course there's not enough space and there's too much competition within a population. That's really gonna accelerate the loss of these species. I'm sure, as you know, we're in our 6th mass extinction event. Birds are one of the top animals that are in decline. A lot of that has to do with insect decline and their food. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that, yes, erecting cities and cutting down the Amazon is really, really bad, but also our use of fossil fuels and point source pollution into water sources is also a direct effect on wildlife. So restoration can only go so far, as well as conservation. We need to make sure that we are actually making this planet cleaner than it already is, so that these animals can live a healthy life.
If we don't do it for ourselves, let's do it for the animals.
Yeah, let's do it for the animals and for, our children too. That's the definition of sustainability, at least in a human sense, is making sure that the future generations have a healthy place to live.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me and giving me the space to talk about our organization and get a little bit into ecology and nerd out a little bit.
Yeah, well, that's what it's about. We want to be able to see a bigger picture collectively. And as we become more alert to the influences around us, that helps us to be better planetary citizens, hopefully, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. So that's it for today. I want to say thank you to all of you who carry the torch, who are making change in ourselves and in the planet. And I also want to say thank you to my partner in crime here at Sustainability Now, Scott Billy, who's also our producer. And until next time, live your best life, love the world around you, and together we can save the world.
Thank you for listening to Sustainability Now. Visit sustainabilitynow.global to find resources related to today's program. While you're there, pledge your support by making a contribution to help us shape a world that works. And remember to subscribe, share, and follow us on social media.